As a young girl, I vividly recall these enchanting weeks at my elementary school. This almost palpable thrill would fill the hallways as the large study hall that smelled like chalk and was full of old typewriters would transform into a haven for books. Our guest today, Erica Bailey, remembers these moments as well.
Do you remember the scholastic book fairs that used to come to school?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It makes me want to cry thinking about this.
Honestly, I get emotional too thinking back about those times, how once I got my hands on the book The Giver, I never let it go. For Erica, the one that stuck out with her was
The biography of Harriet Tubman. I used to read it over and over and over again.
Reading this profound history repeatedly, one filled with abolition and unwavering determination, led by this woman she could see herself in, that left Erica with a profound new feeling.
It then became really important to me to know if I was descended from folks who had been enslaved. So I ended up embarking on a journey that's probably more than 30 years now. I am likely the descendant of those who have been enslaved.
The layered intertwining of these pain-filled and powerful histories has gifted Erica with a remarkable new vantage point, especially in how she appreciates who she's become with her role in healthcare.
And so to me, I am my ancestors' wildest dream.
Welcome to Black Care Matters, the show where we honor the unique experiences of Black nurses working in the Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Rashida Quinn. In recognizing that Black lives matter, it's crucial that the care for these nurses also matters. Cultural white supremacy has had a detrimental impact on the American healthcare system. Each nurse's story reveals rich insights towards the possibilities of a better future. Our guest today, Erica Bailey, the president of the Alliance of Black Nurses Association of Oregon, walks us through her journey growing up biracial, how the changes she faced, feeling like an outsider, informed her nonlinear journey over 13 years in the nursing profession, and what it means to her to be a seeker, always on the lookout for emotional growth in every aspect of her life. It's a fulfilling conversation packed with an unwavering honesty, only on Black Care Matters.
My entire nursing career has been in Oregon.
But you're not from here originally. You grew up in Redondo Beach.
Yeah.
What were some of the highlights and struggles that sort of stand out to you as you reflect?
It was very much sort of that quintessential California surf culture, Volkswagen bugs and blonde-haired, blue-eyed people.
Uh-huh.
You know, my mother is white, and to have this experience of wanting to be like my peers, but in so many ways not being able to be like my peers. Like, I remember desperately wanting my hair to feather. That was a big deal in the 70s and early 80s. And I remember my mom trying to curl my hair and get it into this like feather-like structure. And it would just end up being this fuzz on the top of my forehead. I was definitely a raisin in the buttermilk.
Uh-huh.
One of my friends, he had left school because he was queer. He was 6'5", like 300 pounds, loved to do drag kind of makeup and stuff. And you could only imagine that people tormented him at school.
Yeah.
And we were really close. And he was the first person that ever came out to me when I don't know, I think I was 12.
Yeah.
And I remember my reaction being like, okay, like it didn't occur to me to feel any other kind of way about it, which I always kind of cherished. I ended up hanging out with a lot of drag queens, drag shows, and I found my place there because these were sort of the folks that, you know, society was rejecting, quite frankly, but I felt wholly accepted. But I did experience that exceptionalism because I was advanced in most of my studies. I skipped 6th grade. I was supposed to graduate high school early, go off to college early, but that didn't end up being my path. Socially, there was a lot going on. I really struggled with my relationship with my mom. And by the time I was 14, I wasn't living at home anymore. I ended up moving in with my sister. So I left everything that I knew. And here I was, biracial. I had a mohawk. I was not really palatable for anyone when I walked into that school. And then also be sort of like this odd person that didn't quite fit on one side or the other. The people who were least welcoming to me were the Black girls.
Yeah.
They used to pick on me on the bus. They used to pull on my hair and ask me where I got my weave. It definitely messed with my identity because I wasn't white enough for white folks and I wasn't Black enough for Black folks. And, at that time, there weren't a lot of mixed people running around. I definitely navigated if I could pick, what would I be? I knew that it would be easier to be white, but I never wanted to be. Because so much about Black culture was just so incredible.
Yeah.
That I was like, no, why would I want to turn away from that? It felt infectious. But the one thing I wanted to go back to those girls is I understood what was happening there and I did not have the language for it. But I knew, and I've always struggled to even really tell this story because when you talk about colorism, I know that my dark-skinned sisters, the story of what they're facing in relation to colorism, I think feels to me more relevant than mine. Because mine kind of relates back to privilege, right? Oh, if I'm not Black enough to fit in Black community, poor me, but I am then maybe more palatable to white community, where folks with darker skin, that story is more oppression, more discrimination, what have you. So I always felt like I didn't have the right to tell that story, or I didn't have the right to maybe want empathy because there were people whose experiences were more difficult than mine, were harder than mine. Yeah. And so I was holding that, knowing that they're mad at me, but I can't really be mad at them because I understand. And I actually find that to be kind of profound because I couldn't have articulated it then.
Right.
But I do remember how I felt. And I remember this isn't the time for me to take up more space. It's time to take up less.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is a key to wholeness in the conversation around colorism within the Black community, because you're describing an emotional intelligence, a depth of empathy, and understanding that although I am experiencing harm from people who are darker than me, what they're doing is rooted in a feeling of lack, that they won't have the same access to this world and its resources that I do. And when people act out of that space, the root is a pain, is a hurt, is a wound.
Yeah.
And the expansion of that wound is the harm that you're feeling. Right. So really, everybody's in the same wound.
We are.
And it all doesn't belong to us. We all didn't start it. And so the intelligence that you had as a child and that you're also bringing into this conversation now, I think is the key to opening the conversation around colorism within the Black community with the type of compassion and softness that it requires to express all of the ways we felt in the wound. Yeah. Then it doesn't have to be about who has the right to hurt the most in the wound.
It's a community wound. It's a collective wound.
It's a collective wound.
Yes.
And we can all talk about how painful it was to be in it. And when we acknowledge the root of that coming from the white supremacist culture that was forced into the cultivation of this country since day one, it allows us all to have a wholeness in understanding how we were harmed by it.
I love everything about what you just said. And there are parts that have taken me nearly 50 years to really put that all together.
Yeah.
And I think one important component to bring to this part of my story is that my mother was racist. My mother was of the mindset that she had literally provided us privilege by bringing her whiteness to us.
Ah.
I can't even remember a time that my mother provided me any input that there was anything good about my Blackness. She had such disdain for so many things that were associated with Black culture.
Right.
Really kind of integral to Black culture, right? God rest her soul. She hated the sound of like kind of traditional Black singers like Aretha, right? Like, how do you take Aretha out of Black culture? Where I loved Aretha, it was almost like a secret. And I took little pieces of it where I could get it.
I know that music is important to you. And, you know, from Marvin Gaye to Stevie Wonder and Bill Withers and Erykah Badu, that's a big spectrum, but it's all connected to this sort of grounding Black sound. Are there any moments or personal memories with music that stand out?
So my sister is a vocalist and a musician. She was in this group with two other Black women. They used to rehearse in this building right on Hollywood and Vine. And I used to go and hang out with them while they were rehearsing, and I'd walk around in their high-heeled shoes. But the song that they really, really loved was Star Love by Cheryl Lynn. And they used to put on that song, and we'd all get into it, and I'd dance around in these shoes.
Oh.
My sister ended up being a Mary Jane girl, if you're familiar with Rick James and the Mary Jane Girls,
That
all
is
night long.
So awesome.
Yeah. So Rick James called and sang me happy birthday on my 13th birthday.
Oh
so
my
it's about
gosh,
that
I
time.
love that.
Yeah. But it was these women and these experiences that brought more Blackness into my life.
Yeah.
And I was welcomed there. As I was coming through my adolescence and like early adulthood, I finally am able to have friends and create my own social networks that were, you know, quite diverse. I spent most of my like later adolescence and then early 20s like in the Hollywood, West Hollywood area.
Right. Yeah.
In my late 20s, I moved to Hawaii. I lived there for about 9 years. I found myself at the end of that time. I had had a baby, and it just occurred to me, Erica, you just have to get on a path. Start some movement somewhere. Maybe things will just start to sort of fall into place. I had tried a number of times to go back to college in my 20s, but it was just hard to do that and work full time. When my daughter was born, I was finally eligible to get like financial aid. And so it just occurred to me, this might be the perfect time for me to go back to school. I told the woman that I was like living with that I was leaving. I sold all of our stuff, including my car. I packed up my baby and we got on a red-eye flight and landed here in Portland. And I started school a month later. Nursing was not even on my radar. But as I was moving through some of my classes, it was this random conversation with this girl named Erica in my writing class. She was like, you know, you really should think about nursing. I think it's really flexible for somebody who's a single mom. And I was like, oh, no, I'm not good at math and science. Those really aren't my strengths. Well, the next semester I took my first biology class and I loved it. I was really good at it.
Excellent.
And so nursing really did feel like it might be a good fit. Before I started nursing school the year prior, I went to this Oregon Students of Color conference. I was pretty new even in exploring the health sciences. It didn't occur to me that people had different health outcomes because of where they lived or the color of their skin. Like I kind of knew, but I had never been presented data. The gentleman who led that session, he overlaid all these maps of Portland talking about where the rates of asthma and cancer and like where all the poor folks lived. And once they moved all the Black folks out of like North and Northeast Portland, all of those incidence rates followed those groups out to these specific zip codes. And I had been searching for the intersection of social justice and nursing. My whole world was opened up, and I was like, this is what I want to do. This is why I'm here. And so from that moment on, I have been pretty solely focused on helping to address what I now call inequities. They're not disparities. They don't exist just out of happenstance. They exist because of the persistent inequities in our society. And that's been a real driving force in my nursing career.
Yeah. So what I love about this is you mentioned the moment where you were aware that you needed to find a path. And then as soon as you were on that path, boy, did it take off.
It sure did.
You have this amazing ability to be a seeker. Sounds like it was very much rewarded with opportunities to continue growth and to keep putting the pieces together. It sounds like you were able to find a wholeness as you came into your fullness as a nurse. And I'm curious, do you feel that? Do you feel that you are integrated and that this was a process of integration and holistic care for you and then for your community as a nurse?
You know, you dream about something and you see it in an idealized way. And then when you're within the system, you sort of start to see some of the realities and you can get jaded a little bit or disheartened a little bit. You know, I always say you kind of come out of nursing school with a cape, like, I'm going to go save the world. And then you realize, like, number one, you can't really save the world. Number two, in a lot of cases, the world doesn't want to be saved, right? Like, even being in primary care, I realized that I wanted to bring a more holistic approach, but a lot of patients didn't actually want that. I had been in education for a couple of years. You know, things were going well, but I was starting to not feel well, quite frankly. And so I started seeking out other people sort of in my healthcare web. I had wished that maybe I had taken a more complementary health or integrative health path. Like, why hadn't I become a naturopath? Because I was experiencing a lot of healing and I wanted to be able to bring that healing to others.
That totally makes sense.
I would say right around that like 5 to 6 year mark, really embarked on a journey within. And so I just knew something was missing. I remember even in January of 2020, when I met my therapist, I was fortunate enough to find a Black therapist. But I remember saying to her, like, I'm walking around with this hole.
Right.
And through that, I thought I can still be a nurse, but I was really trying to explore other ways I could be in the world. I wanted it to be less grounded in Western medicine. I never wanted to be a pill pusher. I always wanted to be able to treat people in all the ways.
Is that where the African traditions and spiritual exploration came into play? And if so, what did you pull from those spaces to help you understand this deeper desire for healing abilities?
I really started to recognize that what needed healing was my spirit. I wanted to look towards my own ancestral traditions. But at the same time, the racial uprising was happening in 2020.
Yeah.
And here I am working in a predominantly white institution. People were shocked at all the things that were happening, but then they kind of moved on. And I couldn't move on because I was carrying so much grief that a lot of folks were carrying, but specifically folks in the Black community. I can't just move on to the next news cycle here. And it was interesting that I had turned away from that because of what was happening societally with all the racial stuff following the murder of George Floyd. I was kind of turning away from my whiteness. I was turning away from whiteness in general because it couldn't give me what I needed at that time.
Right.
But then there came this moment where one of my good friends, who was actually one of my first Black friends as an adult, she invited me to the cookout, like literally and figuratively. And she said something to the effect of, Erica, both parts of you are beautiful. Both parts of you are meaningful. You don't have to pick one over the other. And I was like, mind blown. So at the same time that I'm figuring out that I don't just have to lean in this one direction, which feels more relevant and meaningful and important, I can have both. My career-wise, I started to realize that I am a healer. I'm a nurse, for goodness sakes. I am 100% a healer. And I want to be able to tend to the spirit in addition to the physical body as a healer. but I can do that as a nurse.
Oh, this is so rich and so bountiful. You are someone that made space for a wild dream, and then it got to fill in, in a way that defied the structures being given as the only way to pursue wholeness or spirituality or healing. To me, that's a testament of the potential that we're seeking as we move through the type of crises around racial reckoning. I know you've described that 2020 brought about significant changes in the way that you were seeing yourself and seeing other people, and realizing code switching wasn't serving you anymore, sort of parsing off parts of yourself to be more palatable for a white audience or a white space.
I'm still very much code switching or pacifying just to do what needs to get done.
Right.
I am not occupying any kind of utopia in that regard. But you know what happens when those moments happen? The residue that it leaves on me feels so much worse than it used to, because it's in such contrast to how I really want to be. But it's usually when I'm dealing with power.
Right.
Okay, well, in order to get what I need out of this situation, I have to do this thing. I feel like doing that little dance.
I mean, it's also...
Get by.
It just sits different in the body when you recognize it as a performance.
Yeah.
I can definitely relate. When you have to take it on as a forced assimilation process and you're not really even aware of where you begin and where it ends. But when you've been able to separate it out and you see it for what it is and you use it as a key to the lock sometimes because you got to get through the door, then there is an empowerment part of that, even if you have to take a really long shower afterwards spiritually. We are trying to get in control of something that is so big and so massive and find our power through an establishment of power that was literally built with the intention of keeping us out. And it's all pervasive, and it works in silence. It works in loudness. It has all of these components and veins and ways that it keeps itself alive. So I think the survival techniques that we develop to navigate it are just necessary until we're not doing that anymore.
I wanted to add one more thing. It leads back to the Black nurses. ABNOW was formed in February of 2020, and I had community. I was very isolated as a Black nurse prior to that time. I had, for several years, wanted to start a chapter of the National Black Nurses Association, but I'm like, I don't know 11 other Black nurses. You needed 12 nurses to charter. I don't even think I knew 3 Black nurses. So I didn't have community in that way. Kind of leads back to this whole idea of why Black care matters so much, because we can't heal on our own. We do need community. It's so important. And I'm really wholly invested in that.
I think you've beautifully summarized the power of representation, the power of community, the ways in which healthcare, integrating the self, the spiritual wholeness, the fact that people that look like you and represent the cultures that you identify with are actually, not figuratively, but truly a part of your wellness. That we have data now that shows social determinants of health are related to having care of those who look like you. We are in a time period where we're re-examining DEI and learning that diversity has different bodies in this space, but all sort of occupying the same cultural assimilation. And so what you're saying is, no, that's not diversity. That's not full equity and inclusion. It means I get to occupy the space of my own identity, and that may look different from you, and you figure out how to be in the space with me. All of these ways that you've collected your strengths along the path and then centered that in the community of other Black nurses
kind of come together in this story of experiencing what your family went through with your brother's diagnosis. What would you like to share about how you got to show up in that space for your family?
I got a call from my brother in January of 2022, and he was in the emergency room. He had fluid in his lung. I was still very much in my COVID caution. There was no part of me that was going to like hop up and go run to like the epicenter of like an emergency room. But he said to me as we were wrapping up that call that he was scared. I told my daughter, go to the emergency room. The next couple of months, we went through a number of procedures, draining his lung over and over again, waiting for tests and things. There were only a couple of reasons why this would be occurring. We found out my brother had stage 4 adenocarcinoma. My brother was in and out of the hospital, so I'm like accessing notes and labs and just trying to sort everything out and trying to keep my family informed. But my brother felt like he couldn't choose no treatment. He literally said, I don't think my family could deal with that. But when it came to choosing the treatment, how are you possibly supposed to decide? And he said, I trust you. So I read through all those papers about the standard of care treatment and the clinical trials. So in the end, all I could tell my brother was, if I were choosing this for me or for my child, this is what I would pick. I don't know what else to tell you. And he said, that's all I can ask of you. Because it felt like a huge burden to sort of tell him what to do.
Right.
But during that time, like, we were just so close, you know, having the opportunity to sit there with him all through. He was always a hard stick and like just advocating for him all along the way. And I so incredibly grateful that I was as intimately involved in this journey as I was, because it ended up being a gift. I can remember when we learned that, the treatment wasn't working as we had hoped.
Uh-huh.
I just remember him putting a hand on me because, I mean, we'd both been strong. This isn't easy information to receive.
Absolutely.
But I always go back to that moment because he hated that we were suffering. I know that he probably would have taken on more suffering if he could have spared us. But I realized that, wow, what would this have been like if I wasn't in this equation? I couldn't help guide this ship in a way that felt like it centered him, you know, like he had an advocate, and that was me. And I couldn't have done it the way that I did it if I wasn't a nurse. We did discover that my brother's cancer had metastasized, and I had to tell him that he was dying, which was like probably the hardest conversation I've ever had.
Right.
My journey towards nursing and the spiritual stuff and just the transformation that I was experiencing personally was all preparing me for this. And I didn't need to turn away from nursing. I needed to lean into nursing. I just finally got it, like the intersection of me and all the facets of me as a nurse is everything I wanted myself as a healer to be. I've been searching all this time. I've been doing all of this work and waiting. I kept asking for a sign. Where is the sign? And then all of a sudden it was like this balm, if you will.
Yeah.
Of like, oh, you're right here, exactly where you're supposed to be. You have everything that you need.
That's the thing that really transforms everything that happens next, is that you're showing up as only you could show up. And sounds like that your family will be forever grateful for in all of the different dimensions that we exist in this life and beyond it. And what a blessing for you also to have that ultimate confirmation.
I think it really was a matter of feeling it, internalizing it, embodying it, and being like, okay.
And I think that's a beautiful message to leave with our listeners and, what we hope to pass down to those that come after us and our children is trusting those feelings of enoughness, even if they're few and far between. I feel really touched by the meaning you've infused in the name of the show, Black Care Matters, because you brought so many facets of care to the conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
In my opinion, American culture does not deal with death or grief very well. In our society, there is a hyper-focus on youth, always the acquiring of more. The higher up the economic ladder one is, the more robust their value as a human. But death is the ultimate equalizer. The poorest of poor and billionaires will die. So how we hold death and care for the grief process is so important. I love so many things about Erica's story, especially how making greater space for her authentic self, for African ritual, nursing, and Italian culture to become bedfellows in her soul led to her seamless ability to become a death doula for her brother and grief doula for her family. This choosing to feel into her true spirit started so early, listening to Aretha Franklin despite her mother's disdain for the big black sound, holding Harriet Tubman's story like some hold Bible verses. In her words, collecting blackness like secrets and saying yes to them. You know, grief and pain and how to hold and metabolize it is nothing new to Black people. One of the most gorgeous parts of my conversation with Erica is the tender talk about colorism and bullying within the Black and biracial experience. How there is this collective wound that the construction of whiteness has cast over all Black people, no matter their proximity to whiteness. As a dark-skinned Black woman, the way Erica expressed sorrow for her teenage heart and at the same time empathy for girls who were bullying her brings me to this new emotion, some kind of grace-filled hope, laced with pain, yet buoyed by the power to heal and learn to do better. In January of 2024, Erica Bailey became the new president of the Alliance of Black Nurses Association of Oregon. Thank you, Erica, for sharing your deeply rich story. The Alliance of Black Nurses is resting in capable, astute, and deeply heart-centered hands. Join us next month as these stories of amazing Black nurses continue to wow our hearts and uplift our minds. Black Care Matters is presented by the Alliance of Black Nurses Association of Oregon, sponsored by the Oregon Center for Nursing, and was recorded at KBOO Studios here in Portland, Oregon. This episode was produced by Ida Hardin, with production support and mix mastering by Ramoy Phillip. Our executive producer and host, myself, Rashida Quinn. The Black Care Matters podcast website was designed by Brendan Quinn, with portrait art created by Ryan Alexander Tanner. Special thanks to Danae Hall of the Alliance of Black Nurses Association of Oregon, Kelly Castanegro, and our team at KBOO, Jezaniah Hawthorne, Zoe Ezekiels, and Selena Flores. This podcast would not be possible without the generous grant from Oregon Center for Nursing. Thank you to our grant team, Rick Allgeier, Dawn Schoenthal, and Callie Giesler. And here's a special invite to all of you, our listeners. Please engage with what you hear and learn on Black Care Matters. Did listening to an episode remind you of a racialized experience you had in healthcare? Did it strengthen your commitment to anti-racism in your own workplace or community? Did it bring up questions about how you can better speak out against white supremacy culture? Please reach out with your questions and comments at blackcarematters.org/contact. We would love to feature our listeners' feedback on a special episode of Black Care Matters. Your voice matters. Listen to Black Care Matters wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, why don't you leave us a review? Your words really do help us reach a wider audience. It's been a pleasure sharing this with you. We'll have a new conversation for you next month. Until then, remember, Black care does matter. It's a matter of how we make those words count.